Good afternoon. So let's get started. We have two things planned for today. One of them is sort of critical. We're going to try and make sure we get through that. The other one would be helpful, but is not a big deal if we don't get through it. So let's start with the first thing. What I want to do is I want to sit down with a case, take it apart, figure out how the case reaches the decision that it does, talk about it a little more broadly, and piece together some principles to help us understand where this law and equity divide comes into play. So I'm going to give you the case, and I want you guys to take a couple of minutes and look up what you can look up for it. And I'm going to warn you that this is the fifth time that I've run this tutorial today, and at least two of the earlier tutorials today found not great sources. And I say this because there was a question that I asked that was fairly straightforward if you had a good source in front of you that they just could not answer. So here's the case, right? It is Walsh versus Lonsdale. Now I realize that having said this, you're now going to immediately start texting the group chat to find out what it is that I was looking for, and that's fine. That's fine. So take a minute and get yourself together and get ready to talk about Walsh versus Lonsdale. Okay, so let's get started. First thing that I would like is I would like someone to describe to me the facts in Walsh versus Lonsdale. And by facts, I mean, I want you to tell me the things that get us up to the courthouse door. Okay? So what are the facts in Walsh versus Lonsdale?
Um,
Go ahead, Helena.
Sorry, I just saw that somebody typed it in. But basically, there was an agreement for a lease of a mill provided for 7 years, with a set amount of rent per year for each loom that would be worked.
Uh-huh.
And there was a set of stipulations as to the amount of looms that would be worked, that were supposed to be worked each year.
Uh-huh.
And then it also had provisions that 1 year's rent should always be payable in advance upon demand. And then the rent had been paid, right? The plaintiff had paid quarterly, right? The plaintiff had paid the rent quarterly.
Uh-huh.
And there, right, okay, so the plaintiff had paid the rent quarterly, which didn't necessarily fulfill all of the requirements. So the defendant then gave notice of the intention to demand the year's rent in advance, because he hadn't met the minimum amount.
Uh-huh.
And then it was held.
Well, no, we're not.
Okay.
We're not at the holding yet. We're still.
Okay.
We haven't even gotten to the courthouse door yet, right?
Okay.
So we understand the terms of the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Gotten all of that correct. Great job. When Lonsdale demands the year's rent paid in advance,
Mm-hmm.
what does Walsh do?
Right. So Walsh. Okay, Walsh brought an action? Is that what you meant?
You're jumping ahead, right?
Oh,
So
let me see.
he refuses to pay, right? He
Oh,
says
okay.
no.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So then what does Lonsdale do? Right. You guys are correct here in the chat. Walsh refuses to pay. So what does Lonsdale do?
I'm not sure, sir. Do you mean like after that part? Like he refused to pay, the defendant wanted him to pay, and then he brought action in court? Or something else in between there?
So where we are in the sequence of events is that Walsh has refused to pay. At this point, there's nothing that would cause Walsh to bring an action, right? There's no claim here for Walsh. So Lonsdale has to have done something to have started the process where Walsh can bring a lawsuit, right? Right now, given the events that we have right now, Lonsdale has a claim. He could bring a lawsuit. Walsh has nothing, but we know that Walsh brought the lawsuit. So Tiani has it correct, right? Lonsdale engages in what's called distress, or sometimes you hear it called distraint. And this is a common law remedy where landlords can seize the chattels of tenants who are behind on their rent. And so at that point, Walsh has a claim for a wrongful distress. He says, hey man, I'm not behind on my rent. You just stole my stuff. Okay? Exactly, right? Exactly right, Debbie. Exactly right. Okay. So this has brought us to the courthouse door. Okay. Couple of things that I want to unpack from this story and just talk about in a little more detail. The first thing is the facts make clear that until Lonsdale makes his demand, that Walsh is paying his rent on time, quarterly in arrears. So what does it mean to pay your rent in arrears? What do you mean by trailing, Helena? I think you may be right, but can you explain what you mean by that?
I just meant if you are paying outside of the time that you're supposed to pay. So for example, if you're supposed to pay on the first of a period, you may pay the 15 for the first of the following period or so. So you're always behind.
Okay, you're right about the concept, but there's a prescriptive part of what you're saying that isn't necessarily true, right? So you're right that it's paying at the end of the month rather than at the beginning, or in this case at the end of the quarter instead of at the beginning. So you're paying for use you've already had and not use that you're about to have. Okay, so this is something that's not uncommon in commercial relationships, because a lot of times you have to have possession of the property in order to be able to use it to make the money that you use to pay the rent, right? So you can't start paying rent until you've had possession of the property. especially for like agricultural land or industrial land where the property is being put to a particular use and may have like fixtures and whatnot. But I don't know about you guys. I have been renting from landlords since I was 18 years old, and I have never had an opportunity to pay rent in arrears. Um, there have been times where landlords have gone, okay, well you can pay it when you get it when I've had financial distress, but um, I've never had an agreement that let me live in an apartment for a month and then pay for that month. So that's just a small point that I want to bring up to make sure that we know that, hey, sometimes things that don't make sense because our experience is residential, right? Our personal experience is residential. Sometimes it makes sense in a commercial context. The other thing I want to do is I want to make the point, right? This is a relationship that was humming along, had been humming along for almost 2 years. They had clearly intended to be in this relationship for 7 years. What would make Lonsdale blow the whole thing up? Why would he suddenly come in and demand a year's payment in advance that he knew he wasn't going to get? What might be going on here? And let me be clear about this. There's no right answer to this because there's no facts to tell us what's going on. This is all informed speculation. We've got some facts and we're trying to get inside these guys' heads. Okay. So yeah, and you guys are saying the same thing over in the chat, right? Halana says maybe Lonsdale really wanted Walsh out. Aisha says maybe he had better offers, right? So, same thing. And I think, those are reasonable, other reasonable options, right? He might have had cash flow issues where he just he couldn't wait for the next 3 quarterly payments. He needed them now. All of these are reasonable options. The other thing that I think, and if I'm being honest, this is what I think is going on. The cotton industry is changing at this point. It's changing in the late 19th century, right? We've watched the end of chattel slavery sort of throughout the common law writ, eventually, finally, in the United States. This is, the late 1870s is right at the end of Reconstruction. So there's being a fundamental change in how freedmen are being treated in the U.S. There's some fundamental changes in, earlier there was a period of time where American cotton just disappeared from the global market because of the Union blockade of the Confederacy. So the cotton industry is going through some significant changes, right? This is late 1870s is 20 years after the Lancashire textile strikes, where the unions started to become prevalent in English textile mills. So what I think is going on is Lonsdale sees that this business is dying. And he recognizes that Walsh is going to run out of money, right? And so the whole plan is really about getting your hands on assets ahead of Walsh's creditors, right? Stepping in line to be repaid before other creditors and getting your hands on things that will generate income for you. That's what I think is going on. Why am I talking to you about all of this, right? Some of you are probably thinking that. because your clients are going to come in and they're going to have problems, right? You're going to have Walsh walk into your office and say, I don't understand why my landlord just came in and seized all my goods. He came in, he demanded a year's rent in advance, which he's not entitled to, and then he just up and grabbed everything in the warehouse. I don't know what's going on. And you have to both be able to sort of deal with the problem that's in front of you and also understand that there's a larger context. And that larger context is going to shape the interests of the litigants to change what kind of a resolution they'll be open to, right? So to continue sort of telling you the story of Walsh in your office, right? You might be able to negotiate a resolution for these guys, but not if you don't recognize that Lonsdale thinks that Walsh is going out of business. You're going to have to deal with that perception in order to negotiate with Lonsdale's counsel. Does all of this make sense so far? Like what we've talked about and why we've talked about it? Does this make sense? Hello? Anybody there? Okay. So I'm actually you gotta tell me what you want me to repeat because I've just talked for like 10 minutes. I'm not going to repeat all of that again. So like I don't want to be, I'm not being a jerk, but I've been running my mouth for a while. So okay. Well, I wasn't saying anything. I was waiting for you guys to say something. But the last thing I said was that I wanted to make sure that this made sense, right? What we were what we had talked about and why we had talked about it. Okay. Okay. So again, right, the thing that I want you to understand is that the practice of law is about understanding people's lives, right? Yes, you have to understand the doctrines. You have to understand how this works, right? In terms of in the courts. But at the end of the day, what you are doing is you are going to be changing people's lives for the better or for the worse. And in order to do that responsibly, you have to understand where they're coming from. You have to understand what's going on in their lives. I had a boss once who made a point of always reading like the trashiest, worst romance novels because he wanted to get in the heads of the kinds of people who read those books because he represented them and they were on his juries. And so he wanted to be reading what they were reading. I'm not suggesting you do that. I certainly never did. But it's one way to think about this, right? That you got to be able to understand the lives of the people you're working for. So that's why we're talking about all of this. Okay, so now let's come back. You know, we've sort of pulled back and looked at the global cotton trade. Now let's come back to the courthouse where Walsh and Lonsdale are getting ready to go at it hammer and tongs. What is Walsh's argument for why Lonsdale cannot distrain the goods? What is Walsh's argument for why Lonsdale cannot distrain the goods?
I think he was basically trying to say that the whole arrangement had not been properly constructed or executed by deed, so therefore it shouldn't be treated as legal at common law.
Right, absolutely right. Alika, you're saying the same thing in the chat. You're also right. You know, for the common law remedy of distress to be available, you have to have a common law landlord-tenant arrangement. And the common law landlord-tenant arrangement requires a deed, or it did at the time, right? No deed, no relationship. What does Walsh say he has, right? Because think about it. The document says that there's a tenancy for 7 years. Walsh says that can't be what I have because if it's what I have, there would be a deed and there's no deed. Okay. Walsh can't say I have nothing. I have no legal interest in this land, because if he says I have no legal interest in this land, he's a trespasser and he has no rights. So what does he say he has? And I will go ahead and warn you guys now, this is the point where the wheels have come off for your classmates. And I'm telling you, if you're looking at the right source, the answer to this question is right in front of your face. So if you can't find it, either you're not looking at the right source or you're not looking at you're not looking at it correctly.
I'm not sure, but did he say that he had a legal lease? Like,
No, because if he had a legal lease, there would be a deed, right? That's what the law required. So he has to have something that's not he has to have a legal interest that is not the 7-year lease. Adrian,
Adrian,
what kind of tenancy?
Equitable tenancy?
Sorry. Yeah, Adrian, what kind of tenancy? I mean, you are correct that it is a tenancy, but what kind? There's more to it than that. You gotta give me more information, because tenancy involves a term. Right. Absolutely right, Tiani. Walsh is claiming that he has a year-to-year tenancy. Okay? And the consequence of this, according to Walsh, is that he can be kicked out on 6 months' notice. And so the argument is that if Lonsdale's entitled to distress for a year's rent, right, Lonsdale can roll up in January, say, hey, you need to pay me a year's rent in advance, and get the money. And then in February, he can roll up and say, oh, by the way, in 6 months, I want you gone. And there's no recourse for Walsh. Okay, so this is Walsh's argument, is that he's entitled to not have to pay for an entire period because he's not entitled to an entire period of notice. So does this make sense so far, right? Do we understand Walsh's argument? Great, awesome. Okay, next step. How does the Court of Appeal rule? For whom does the Court of Appeal rule, I guess is the first question. Who wins, Walsh or Lonsdale? Right, Lonsdale wins. Lonsdale wins. Now, here's the harder question. Why? What does the Court of Appeal say is why Lonsdale wins?
Okay, from what I'm reading, the courts are saying, the Court of Appeal is saying that since the passing of the Judiciary Act, a tenant doesn't have two separate estates anymore. So they'll be treated as having one equitable tenancy, basically, which would mean that they'll be under the same position as if they were under a lease, what would have been a traditional lease. And therefore, if that is the case, then Walsh would have the actual lease that was that they were agreeing upon, which would be the full 7-year period. So he wouldn't be able to make his argument about being a yearly tenant would fail.
Right.
And
okay.
then, oh, okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Right. And then, right. So based on that, the landlord, which should be Lonsdale, right? So the landlord will be able to exercise his rights entirely as if he had that full lease, and therefore he would be allowed to exercise that remedy. Even though it's traditionally a common law remedy, he would still be able to exercise that remedy under the lease because the courts of equity and common law have fused.
Right.
Have fused.
Right. Okay. So why are we treating the contract as creating a lease when it very clearly did not, right? It said, we're gonna execute a deed to create a lease. Why is it that the court says, oh, well, that's not necessary. We're just going to treat you as if you did that?
Is it because of the principles of equity being applied to the situation?
I mean, Yes, but I feel like you could have figured that out from,
Okay.
the part of the class that we're doing. So I'm going to need you to be more specific.
Um, okay. Okay, so because of the specific equitable principle that equity looks on as done that which ought to be done. So therefore, in applying that maxim to the situation, the courts would give intention to the particulars of the contract, which appeared to have given a more extended period of time, the 7 years, and created a lease. So they would apply that based on the principle.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So let me sort of unpack this and rephrase it maybe in a little less lawyerly language. So the idea is these guys have an agreement. Okay. That agreement includes an obligation for them to create this legal estate, this lease. Okay. They didn't fulfill that obligation. Now, the court has the power of specific performance. The court actually could have said, hey, you guys, go and do this lease. Okay. That would have been an available remedy. And then Lonsdale would have had all the rights attached to being a common law landlord, and Walsh would have had all the protections of being a common law tenant. The court goes, why should we make you jump through that unnecessary hoop? We can just say, we're going to treat you like you did what you should have done. You made this agreement, and we're going to treat it as if you followed through on it. So does this make sense for you guys? Okay, Adrian understands. Awesome. This is important, so I want to make sure, like, okay, Alika gets it.
Yes and no, sir.
Okay.
Sorry.
What still got you confused?
Right. So what you said made sense. I'm just wondering why the court is trying to make it a play. Why didn't they, like, I think the whole point of the lease being like a deed and stuff was to make sure that everybody went through the formal processes, everybody understood what they're getting into and stuff. So why were the courts seeking to avoid that in this instance?
I think my answer to that would be, I'm not convinced that the purpose of the deed requirement is to protect tenants. I mean, it could be, right, if you had this sort of epidemic of wrongful distress, where landlords are claiming that tenants are behind on rent and seizing goods that they're not entitled to seize. I could see that as being a tenant protection mechanism. But, and I mean, I don't know a whole lot about the that particular sort of detail of that particular time period, but that seems unlikely to me, that there would be this sort of epidemic of wrongful distress. And it also seems unlikely to me that if there was an epidemic of wrongful distress, that Parliament would care. which is, you know, not a terribly friendly thing to say about Parliament, but, you know, I feel like it's not terribly controversial to point out that legislatures tend to be more responsive to the interests of the rich than the poor. So, so anyway, I'm not convinced that the purpose of the deed requirement was to protect tenants. I think that the purpose of the deed requirement, right? I think the purpose of the deed requirement was to ensure that the interest that passed was a defined legal interest. And to some extent, right, a lot of things in the common law are like Aisha says, just the way the world works, right? You know, these practices sort of develop and evolve. There's not a lot of purpose or will behind how they develop and evolve, and then we find ourselves with this institution that we can't really do anything about. I don't know. I don't have a. I feel like I'm rambling at you, and I hope that I'm not sort of going off on a tangent at you, but I think that's sort of where I fall. Okay, Adrian, go ahead. Adrian, is your mic not working? Yeah.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Right. I'm asking if the distraint would be on the value of the rights on the amount, the contents of the contents owned by Walsh, if they will be for the value of right owed, or there would be in excess of it. What would be the restrictions for the distraint in this circumstance?
Ooh, there's a really good question, right? What happens when a landlord exercises distraint, you know, sells the goods and winds up with more than they're owed? Is that that is the scenario?
Yes. Because he's distraining on the entire context of the apartment or the flat or whatever, but the rent does not amount to the value of what he's holding.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I'm going to be real honest with you, and you may not like this answer. I think you have to take a class from Miss Lancaster to get an answer to that question. I think that.
But when you look at it, it'd be reasonable in the circumstances that the strength would be only on the amount for the rents owed and not more than that.
Right.
I don't know what the law was at that time in 1882, but when you look, as we are discussing equity, it'd be fair and reasonable for the landlord to only put a distraint on the amount that's due and owed for the rent instead of being excessive in the application.
You are absolutely correct about that, but as we all know from Much Ado About Nothing and the good old Constable Dogberry, the law is an ass, and sometimes we don't know. You know, how would you? Well, so the answer to your question, Aisha, is we know what the tenant owes, right? That's quantifiable. And so what happens is the landlord distrains the chattels, sells them, and satisfies the debt. And the question sort of becomes what happens when the sale brings in more than the value of the debt. And I think this is, you know, we can ask a similar question about foreclosures, right? In the mortgage context, what happens when a bank forecloses on a house and sells it for more than the outstanding debt. And I think the answer is that it really depends on the relationship between the debtor and the creditor and how it's defined. I think there are sometimes these relationships specify that distress or foreclosure is what's called non-recourse, which basically means that each side runs the risk of that the other side gets a windfall, which means that if you sell the goods for less than the debt, you're stuck. You can't recover the rest. If you sell the goods for more than the debt, you can keep the overage. So that's what I mean by non-recourse. But then other relationships are recourse, where you can keep going until you recover what you're owed, and but you can't recover more. And so if you sell the goods and they wind up short, well, you can go and seize more goods and sell them. But once you recover more than you're owed, you have to give the rest back. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer to that question, Adrian, but I think it's a really good one. I think that the best way. Go ahead.
Sorry, sir. Wouldn't there then be like some sort of equitable principle relating to that? Because if equity is allowing you to give attention to your original contractual arrangements, it would still be a fixed cost that you owe, and we know you owe fixed costs. So then, shouldn't they try to protect the tenant from just losing extra as well?
Yeah, and I think that if the contract is silent, I think that's probably what equity would require. One of the things that you have to keep in mind is that between 1882 and 2020, the lawyers for creditors have had a lot of opportunity to figure out how to write contracts in such a way that equity can never protect a debtor, right? So you're asking a good question. It's a helpful question. My guess is that the contract would likely be written in such a way that the debtor could not take advantage of equity in the way that you're describing. Does that make sense? Alana, does that make sense?
You said the debtor wouldn't take advantage?
That's in that the debtor can't claim the protection of equity to claw back an overage or to avoid non-recourse. So Adrian,
well, I don't mean.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Helena. We're in the middle of your
conversation. I'm a little bit confused now. I meant, okay, so say I owed $500 and my creditor, my landlord or whatever, sees what he thought was $500 in goods. But when he sold it, he got like $750. Right. Shouldn't I get back like my extra $250?
Again, what I'm telling you is that I would
see that's taking advantage. So that's why I was wondering if that's what you meant.
I mean, taking advantage in the sense of like making use of equity to claim this back, right? So it's not taking advantage in the sense of like putting one over on you. It's just taking advantage in the sense of this is a path that's available to you, right? So I don't see that in the year 2020 of being a path forward, because as Adrian asks, yes, you can absolutely contract out of equity, because equity follows the law, except in the places where arguably law follows equity, right? As I said in my email over the weekend, that there are some places where the Judicature Act provides that equity takes priority over law. So, okay. What other questions do you guys have before we call it a day? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Really appreciate all of the hard work. Really appreciate the engagement. We'll see you guys tomorrow, where we're going to keep trying to sort of work through this law equity divide. So see you guys then. Take care. Bye.